Well, first to introduce myself, as Anna said, I'm a sociologist. I got my degree at the University of Chicago back in the 90s. And I have never served in the military, which is relevant for this talk. I did go overseas after I got my undergraduate degree and served as a volunteer worker in Sri Lanka during their military conflict. I got there 5 days before the Sri Lankan Civil War started, which feels like I had military service, but I never actually carried a weapon and I've never actually trained. So take some of my comments about military service with a grain of salt. And in terms of my ethics and philosophical background, it really came as a sociologist. I began to teach and study ethics at the University of Chicago as part of the Clinical Medical Ethics Center at the University of Chicago. Started to teach medical ethics, and over the years have accumulated quite a bit of understanding about ethical issues. So hopefully you will understand that while I am not a tenured philosophy professor, I have worked with tenured philosophy professors and have some things to share about these topics. Okay. So the first thing that I want to say is that, as with many topics around human enhancement and ethics in general and philosophy in general, defining our terms is a little bit difficult, because if we try to figure out whether something is an enhancement or not, we have to say, well, what does it do? What does an enhancement do? An enhancement is a technology which allows human beings to do things that they otherwise couldn't do. So the mastery of fire was an enhancement. The mastery of fire allowed us to eat foods that would otherwise be difficult to digest. And actually, probably we mastered it a million years ago or so, and it allowed our prefrontal cortexes to grow. So we are a species that has been co-evolving with our technologies ever since we were this kind of monkey. And as the movie 2001 that this image comes from suggested, the mastery of weapons was probably very early for our simian ancestors. And weapons are an extension of our human ability to defend ourselves and to kill others and to hunt and to do all the things that we do with weapons. Motorized vehicles and airplanes are enhancements. We wouldn't otherwise be able to fly. We wouldn't otherwise be able to move at 60, 100 miles an hour without motorized vehicles. So talking about what is an enhancement for a warrior is a bit vague. And if you are to Google these days what a super soldier is or what super soldier issues are, you will find all kinds of clickbait articles that talk about all kinds of things, which most ethicists would not consider biomedical enhancements. Things like exoskeletons, which I will mention in the course of this talk. But so I would argue, and I will return at the end of this talk to the argument that most of what we're thinking about in terms of warrior enhancement, biomedical enhancement of soldiers, is far less dangerous than the kinds of technological enhancements that weapons otherwise pose, especially, of course, weapons of mass destruction. A weapon of mass destruction could kill billions, and it's very unlikely that we will ever invent anything that you could do for a soldier that would allow them to kill billions of people with their body. So let's just start with that. I think this is an important question, but it is not the most important question in military ethics. The kinds of enhancements that we think of for soldiers and warriors probably goes back a long time. There are mythical examples or not well documented examples of, for instance, Viking berserkers taking amanita mushrooms or other kinds of drugs, henbane, before they go into battle in order to enhance their pain, resilience to pain, or their aggression. Not good evidence for that actually having happened. Like the mythical idea that the term assassin comes from people who took hashish. In fact, it was probably, the assassins were probably named after the guy who started the order of assassins, Hassan. Anyway, there are myths about soldiers and warriors taking various kinds of drugs to go into battle. And a far more documented example of this would be alcohol, and at least Anglo-Saxon and Viking warriors taking alcohol to go into battle. Now, again, as you can imagine, their commanders or their fellow warriors probably were very cautious about how much alcohol they were going to take before they go into battle. You don't want to be fighting next to a guy who is, in fact, drunk when they're trying to defend you or kill other people. But a little bit of alcohol could, in fact, be something that would be helpful in that context. And there's a substantial amount of evidence that the American Revolution was fueled by whiskey. They were paid in whiskey. Whiskey was a very common drug of choice at the time. But when we follow the stories told about the history of neurochemical enhancement of warriors told by people like Jonathan Moreno, we really should start with the Nazis and methamphetamine. There was methamphetamine being prescribed for Nazi troops. Americans also took amphetamines of various sorts in World War II and after. And certainly in Vietnam, U.S. troops were issued routinely dexedrine, which was another amphetamine. And many American troops in Vietnam got addicted or started to use heroin at any rate, not with the permission or not being issued by the American military, but it was an adaptation to the tragic circumstance they found themselves in. So drugs and their use by soldiers and warriors goes back a long way. And of course, today, it would be hard to imagine some of the special forces not taking extensively steroids to build muscle and other kinds of drugs, painkillers, and so forth. So there is a prehistory to this. And this is an important point for me as an ethicist, because I do a podcast with my military ethicist colleague, Nir Esakovitz, and we always start every debate that he and I have. He's the Luddite and I'm the techno-optimist. But we just start every debate by saying, is this really a new question? Is soldier enhancement a new question? No, it's not a new question. It's an old question. And most of the things that I'm going to be talking about do not pose novel questions. They pose old questions that may have never been adequately adjudicated, but they are old questions. Okay, things today. Battlefield resilience. And I think I want to start with battlefield resilience because it points up that the ethics of soldier enhancement is also and primarily about making it so more difficult to kill soldiers, right? And the ethics of making it difficult to kill people is not just about, is it a good idea or a bad idea? No, it's a good idea. It's a good idea for people not to be able to be killed. When we say vaccination, that soldiers should be vaccinated, that is a modification of a soldier's immune system, of all of our immune systems, that is an enhancement. It is a novel enhancement of our biomedical system. And it is in the same category, in my mind, with gene therapies that we might then adopt, that we might give to soldiers that would protect them against toxins. As I mentioned, steroids, I'm sure, are widely used by soldiers, but also now there's drugs and hormones like creatine or EPO, which is banned for sports enhancement, but is very useful for building the amount of oxygen in your blood system. But many of the kinds of super soldier therapies that are being investigated are, for instance, for things like trauma treatment in the battlefield. 90% of all battlefield deaths are due to blood loss and shock after an injury, a wound. And so, for instance, DARPA now has this program, the Smart Red Blood Cells program and the powdered synthetic blood research programs. Powdered synthetic blood is something you could carry as a battlefield medic and mix up and infuse people with in the battlefield. Smart Red Blood Cell program is actually a far more imaginative and forward-looking program about loading up blood cells with all kinds of ways of enhancing battlefield resilience that's not just about reinfusing a body with blood. So these are active research programs of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, which is a part of the US military that has for decades been at the forefront of doing advanced biomedical research to apply to soldiers. Now, when I think it was 2 decades ago now that that Air Force pilots, American Air Force pilots flying through the Alps, clipped a gondola and caused it to fall and people to die. And it turned out that the pilots of that flight had been awake for like 24 hours because of amphetamines. And that highlighted the issue that amphetamines have some serious drawbacks for soldiers. They can significantly impair their battlefield acuity, their ability to make good decisions. And there's a lot of research that's been going on for decades now of other kinds of cognitive enhancement drugs that soldiers can take. For instance, modafinil, which does not have many of the drawbacks, the dependency drawbacks or the suppression of sleep or the suppression of appetite drawbacks that amphetamines do. Modafinil, now widely recognized as a possible alternative for stimulant medications. Propranolol is a drug that has been prescribed and developed for cardiovascular issues, but it turns out that if you suppress the parasympathetic response to stress that people have because of PTSD, you can suppress PTSD when they have PTSD, but you can also prevent PTSD if people are going to go into a stressful situation and have a suppressed immune system with a drug like propranolol, they are less likely to develop PTSD. And in fact, 20 years ago, the President Council on Bioethics examined the issue of propranolol suppression of PTSD and wrung their hands, as they were wont to do, about this being some kind of enhancement that would make people forget the Holocaust, which I think is absurd because preventing PTSD is not the same as preventing a memory of a traumatic event. You still remember the event, you just don't have trauma related to the memory of an event. At any rate, it's a form of enhancement. And then brain-computer interfaces, BCIs. Now, when I talk about BCIs, I'm talking about the entire exocortex as well as putting stuff inside the brain. Having a head-up display, having smart glasses, having an EEG monitor, all of these things are parts of an interface between a machine and a brain. But eventually these things will migrate into the brain. We will have technologies to put chips into people's brains. We already are doing that. And so BCIs will eventually and are already being explored to increase focus, suppress fear, do other things that could be useful for soldiers as well as civilians. Now, DARPA, around the world, there's a lot of limb loss as a result of diabetes. But if you are trying to sell research on developing advanced prosthetics, it's a little bit easier to sell it, apparently, if you are selling it for soldiers who have lost limbs in combat, as opposed to the millions of people who lose limbs as a result of diabetes. But it will be eventually available and useful for civilians who have lost limbs in industrial accidents or car accidents or whatever, as well as for soldiers. But at any rate, DARPA has been doing prosthetics research. And in particular, the cutting edge now is trying to integrate neuroprosthetics. So trying to hook a prosthetic arm or a prosthetic leg up that will not only allow the person to control it with a muscle, an intended muscle movement, but also to get haptic feedback from it, so that there will be an impulse from the limb back into the nerves of the person, so that they understand how heavy or how firm the thing is that they're grabbing, that they're trying to lift. Now, if you remember the $6 million man back in the 1970s, he was an astronaut who fell to Earth, lost an arm and a leg and an eye, and had those replaced, and he was called the $6 million man. And in that TV show, he would go around and lift cars with his prosthetic limb. Unfortunately, we're nowhere close to that, because if you have a prosthetic limb and you try to lift a car with it, all you're going to do is rip off your arm. You're not going to be able to actually lift a car. But if you have an exoskeleton that is sufficiently powerful, you might be able to lift extremely heavy loads. You might be, in fact, the $6 million man. And exoskeleton research has been going on for quite a while. It was the Talos exoskeleton research that I show here in this image was actually canceled in 2019. And the current focus of American military research in this domain is to create low power and lightweight exoskeletons for carrying loads like the example above. But we also have the neuroprosthetic research that is coming out of DARPA, and this limb below, this arm below, is an example of a fully developed neurofeedback capable prosthetic limb. Now, sensory enhancement, of course, would be very useful for soldiers, and telescopes and binoculars are examples of ancient, now or old, at any rate, versions of sensory enhancement. But we also have night vision goggles and HUDs, or head-up displays, like the one shown here. And there's even research being done on things like eye drops to provide infrared vision, or temporarily or permanently infrared vision to a naked eyeball. And so there's all kinds of sensory enhancement research being done, sensory enhancement of being able to sense molecules as if you were smelling or tasting them in the air, so that you would be more sensitive to toxins and things like that. There's ways of doing haptic feedback in the body that are being explored with belts and patches, so that a soldier or special forces operative dropped into the field doesn't have something loudly saying, "Oh, warning, warning." It would actually buzz them and say, "Look over there." It would give them a tactile feedback as opposed to an auditory or verbal feedback, or need to be in their field of vision. Presence of improvised explosive devices, for instance, could be sensed with a smell-o-vision of some kind, and then the soldier could be warned with a buzzer on their body. Now, one of the kinds of research that's being done in this domain of sensory augmentation, especially with head-up displays, is what's called augmented cognition. And this is the idea that a soldier in the battlefield is exposed to and needs to know a wide variety of things. They need to see where everybody else is. They need to see where the enemy is. They need to understand whatever can be understood about what weapons are in play, and what their orders are, and where the civilians are, who not to shoot and who to shoot. And all of that can be very overwhelming in the fog of a battle. So augmented cognition is an attempt to say, okay, let's put something on their head that measures their EEG and that gives feedback to the head-up display, so that we can expand or contract the amount of information that the soldier is receiving, in order to provide them with the appropriate non-distracting but focusing amount of information that they need in that situation. We don't want them to be so overwhelmed that it's useless. And the EEG hopefully would be able to detect that. Progress has been slow, but now we have consumer EEG measuring devices, which promise some of the same things about augmented cognition. So progress will hopefully be faster in the future. And as I said, this would be another example of an external brain-computer interface. And eventually we will have implanted brain-computer interfaces, which might be able to provide some of the same kinds of things. Now, once soldiers have head-up displays or implanted brain-computer interfaces, there is the question already of how to connect them to the other soldiers in the battlefield as a hyper-enabled operator, as a human AI team. And the DARPA has a program right now called the MHAT, or the Exploratory Models of Human AI Teams program, which is an attempt to create digital twins of human AI interacting teams in the field that could do things like they're talking about here. Distilling information without human analysis, real-time situational awareness, and communicating with civilians without an interpreter in a real-time way, or with enemy combatants in a real-time way. So they're already exploring this in simulated environments and trying to figure out how they could then roll this out into battlefield operative environments. Now, just to take another step back in history, the scientist, he was an imaging specialist, but a very renowned scientist, J.D. Bernal, wrote a classic book back in 1929 called The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, an inquiry into the future of the three enemies of the rational soul. He was a Marxist, and he also was a scientist, but very interested in the future of science. And what he projected in this book was that eventually there would be artificial limbs, advanced sensory organs that could detect things like X-rays and radio waves and magnetism. Eventually, we might be able to take the brain out of the human body and put it into a robot body and link those robot-connected brains to other brains into some form of collective consciousness. And that these kinds of robot cyborg people would be the ideal inhabitants for space colonization and space habitats. And so that he projected that we would eventually become cyborgs as we migrated into space. He didn't call it cyborgs, but he was one of the visionaries that in the 20th century began to ignite the cyborgian imagination. And Kleins and Klein are the ones who gave the term cyborg to us. In 1960, they wrote a paper for NASA that argued, okay, we've got this problem. We're going to be sending people into space, and there's this astronaut that's going to be floating up in a capsule, maybe for weeks and months, years. What do we do if they start to lose their mind? Will we know if they start to lose their mind? And so they proposed, okay, they will have suits, and these suits will monitor them in other ways. We'll have hopefully cameras and other kinds of ways of monitoring these, but their suits will monitor them, monitor their physical health, their mental health. And if we detect that they're beginning to have a medical problem or beginning to lose their mind, that suit could have a little vial of antipsychotic medication in it that could give them a shot. So we would have remote control of their body from ground control. That was the original idea of a cyborg in space, the having information, automatic telemetry from an astronaut, and the ability to control them through their suit. So the reason I bring that up is that this is pretty much what the direction that we're trying to go with military enhancement. Now, let's talk about the ethics. Soldiers are a vulnerable group, and they have compromised ability to give informed consent. However, while military service limits their autonomy, and I think especially volunteer armies, volunteer soldiers who are not in times of combat or conflict, we should be respecting as much as possible their right of informed consent. But especially if you're a volunteer soldier, you've already signed up for something. And if you didn't do the research and discover that one of the things you signed up for was getting vaccinations, then you have limited reason to complain that then your military service involves getting an unconsented vaccination. In times of conflict, I think we have even more reason to restrict soldiers' rights of informed consent. And existential conflicts will justify overriding the need to respect soldiers' informed consent, I would argue. Now, the Iraq War of 1991, when we went into Kuwait and Iraq, there was the belief, and in terms of bioweapons, there were probably bioweapons in Iraq, but there was the belief that there were bioweapons. And so there were some novel vaccinations being done on US soldiers that were being sent into that conflict. Now, I actually argued against the invasion of Iraq at that time. I have different views today, but at that time, there were soldiers who said, look, there's no good evidence that I need this shot, that it's going to help, and there's a possibility that it could, in fact, harm my health in the long term, and I would rather not get this shot. And the Army said, I'm sorry, you're already on the ground in Kuwait, you're going to get this shot because we think it might help against Iraqi bioweapons. So, for anthrax or whatever. That was the beginning of a debate, the contemporary debate in the U.S. military about whether the president has the right, or the U.S. as commander-in-chief has the right to override soldiers' right to informed consent, right to refuse, because of military contingency. And the current position of the FDA is that although they believe in general we citizens should have informed consent, that informed consent requirements in military operations can be waived if they're infeasible or contrary to the best interests of the recipients. Like today, you could imagine quite a few soldiers coming in who have ungrounded conspiracy theory beliefs about vaccination and say, I never want any vaccination. My church always said not to get vaccinated. And that the military would have a right to say, I'm sorry, this vaccination is in your best interest. You're going to get this vaccination. And the president can override it because it's contrary to national security interests. Now, let's go back to legitimate reasons to be suspicious of those kinds of overriding of informed consent. And one is that there is a military-industrial complex. Insofar as capitalist firms make a profit off of selling weapons or soldier enhancements, insofar as pharmaceutical firms make a profit off of selling drugs, they have an incentive, a capitalist incentive, to overhype their efficacy and to underplay the risks. They also have, in the military contractors, they also have an incentive to overhype the threats, the arms race threats that we face, and to pretend that Iraq has nuclear weapons when it doesn't, so you could sell more weapons to the U.S. military to go in and invade Iraq. And we now know about the history of secret military investigations, not specifically driven in the case of MK Ultra by capitalist incentive, more by national security, Cold War concerns at the time. But MK Ultra was an example of a project that we know existed, Defense and CIA, trying to figure out if combinations of drugs, electric shock, other kinds of treatments would be useful for breaking down soldiers in POWs who had been captured and trying to brainwash them, the Manchurian candidate kind of scenario, or teaching soldiers how to protect themselves against those kinds of scenarios. And lots of research was done in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s without people's consent on civilians, on children, and on soldiers to figure these things out. All kinds of terrible examples. If you read Jonathan Marino's book, Mind Wars, Brain Research and National Defense, he details this history. And this history is important for another reason, which is that as we learn about things like the Tuskegee experiments that were done, the Tuskegee experiment that was done in the 1930s through the 70s on Black farmers in Alabama, we have learned, we have also created some of the conspiracy theory environment that we currently live in, because there is evidence that MK Ultra existed, and there is evidence that Black farmers were lied to by the federal government to get them to continue to have syphilis in this experiment. And so now, if African Americans don't trust the federal government and everything that they're telling them about, drug safety, there's a reason. There's a reason people are suspicious about these things. So we have to protect consent and transparency and have good oversight of medical research in military context, even when it's a national security Cold War context, because it will have long-term deleterious consequences for trust in science and in the federal government. But we also know that there is an iron triangle of defense contractors. You start as a politician, you give the defense lobbyists come to you, you give lots of money to their firm, then you lose your election and you immediately go and become on the board of directors of the defense contractors. Maybe you're a former military official and you become a defense contractor, or you go into politics or whatever. There is a nexus of military industrial people who benefit from selling an arms race to push contracts for particular kinds of technology. And in the context of soldier enhancement, soldiers are unwilling guinea pigs for this experimentation. And we need to be conscious of the fact that even if soldiers do not have a right to informed consent or to reject these kinds of experiments, that they are the subject of potentially capitalism-driven unnecessary risk by military contractors who are hyping a particular need to do a particular thing to soldiers that we may, in fact, in a more rational environment, not want to do. And I will submit that this administration, full of some of the least qualified people to ever run the federal government, are incentivized to strip out every oversight that we had in place to control this kind of exploitation of military contracting. And this particular Department of War head is particularly obsessed with warrior manliness and with how macho our soldiers look. And I suspect that he has a pretty soft touch for military contractors trying to sell military enhancement. Don't have any immediate evidence. I would just suspect that it's the case. Now, let me put it on the table an objection to military enhancement that I think is absurd. That is the lowering the threshold for war objection. There are technologies that I am concerned about for lowering the threshold to war. Those technologies would be things like robot armies, not human enhanced soldiers, robot armies. The scenario of having to command a bunch of National Guardsmen or Marines or Navy men to go and do something unjust and immoral, and having some of them at least say, we're not going to do that, we're going to go AWOL, we're going to turn our weapons back on the Tsar, whatever the situation is, that scenario versus the Tsar or Putin or Xi having a robot army that has 10 people that they have to, 10 humans that they have to keep on side versus robots that they can just order to go do things. That is, I think, lowering the threshold for war. But the idea that having super soldiers who have an increased resilience to disease or an increased resilience to battlefield wounds, or who are able to carry heavier loads, that any of that would be an increase in the likelihood that they would be used to go to war, I think is at least irrelevant, if not absurd. So the corollary of that argument would be that soldiers should be made as vulnerable and defenseless as possible in order to reduce the propensity of war. And I think if we understand that that's the corollary, we understand how absurd this particular argument against soldier enhancement is. Okay, let's talk about just war for a second. The causes of the war, of the causes of a military conflict, are very important for determining whether it is a just war. So defense is usually considered a just reason to go into battle. Is your conflict declared by a legitimate authority, or is it just a fatwa by some local imam? Is there a good intention to restore peace and justice, or are you being sent into battle to gain territory, or to gain wealth, or to inflict harm? Did you exhaust all of the non-military options for diplomacy before you went to battle? Is there a reasonable hope of success? Are you sending soldiers to an unnecessary death that has no reasonable hope of achieving anything? And are you using proportional ends? Are you using a nuclear strike for, alleged fentanyl importing into the United States? Are you murdering tens of thousands of people for a terrorist strike on your property that killed 10? So the proportionality of ends is an important aspect of this. And there's also the question of the conduct of a war. Military forces should distinguish between combatants and non-combatants and only target the former. Now, if we give soldiers amphetamines and it means that they start indiscriminately killing civilians, that would be a good reason not to give soldiers amphetamines. Doesn't seem to be the case, but that would be one argument. The violence must be proportional to the objective. Soldiers should avoid excessive force, and we have to properly treat POWs and the wounded. Okay, so these are the commonly discussed conditions of just war. The reason I bring them up is that for me, as a consequentialist, I think that there are reasons that we can ask soldiers to accept the risk of involuntary enhancement in military service if their cause is just. If they, in the current case, I would argue that there are different circumstances for Ukrainian soldiers than for Russian soldiers being on the unjust side of a cause and the Ukrainians on the just side of a cause. And asking a Ukrainian soldier to accept a risk is for vaccination or whatever has a different moral justification in my consequentialist mind than asking a Russian soldier to. By the way, I would also argue that it can never be a crime to remind soldiers to ignore unjust orders. We're about to test the theory that a former soldier who is now an elected political official in the United States can be tried for treason for reminding US soldiers that they have the right and obligation to refuse unjust orders. We'll see how far that goes. So insofar as enhancement saves soldiers' lives, I think it can even be morally obligatory even for combatants in unjust wars. And this goes back to cases like if you are a medical POW, so you're an American soldier captured by the Nazis and in World War II, and they discover that you're a medic. And they say, you have to treat some of our soldiers who've come back from the battlefield. Do you have an obligation to treat them? The fact that they have been injured means that they have entered a different moral status, even if they're going to be returned to the battlefield. And so I think you can argue that we have obligations to prevent the deaths even of soldiers involved in unjust wars. But this is a kind of a side argument of the whole thing. In general, I would argue the justness of the war, the justness of the conflict, the justness of the military use that is proposed determines whether we accept that a cyborg is a good cyborg or a bad cyborg. Steve Austin, Captain America, he's portrayed as a good cyborg because he was an enhanced soldier who was fighting Nazis. He was an Antifa super soldier. By the way, this Graham Plattner is an American running for the Senate, and he has a bunch of military tattoos, and he has argued that he has embraced his Antifa super soldier status that some of his tattoos suggest. I would embrace it also. And Antifa is on the side of anti-fascism, is on the side of the good side, fascists on the side of the bad side. Red Skull got the same shot that Captain America got in the comic books, but he was a Nazi, and so that's a bad use of that enhancement. So the difference is not the shot. The difference is the justness of their cause. In terms of proportionality, if the threats that are being faced are imaginary or overhyped, so for instance, if you're a soldier being sent into a highly dangerous conflict, an unnecessary war because of an imaginary threat that Venezuela is importing fentanyl into the United States as a hostile act, there is a strong argument that any risk that we impose on U.S. troops in the context of imaginary threats is an unnecessary risk and an immoral thing to do. And West Virginians are certainly asking that question after a West Virginian who was deployed to Washington, D.C. to walk around picking up trash, got shot and died in that service. Why were they there? Unnecessary death. They shouldn't have been there. Now, another question that often comes up around soldier enhancement is the reversibility of the enhancement and what we do when they are discharged. So clearly, I think we can all agree that temporary and reversible enhancements like drugs or wearables are preferable to permanent enhancements like gene therapies and surgery. We want, if there are any adverse side effects of an enhancement, they may be warranted in the course of service, but we clearly don't want them to be experienced when people are decommissioned and go back to civilian life. So the more permanent the change to a soldier's body, the harder it will be for them to adjust to civilian life, probably. Sometimes, however, soldiers may enjoy whatever enhancements they've been given and want to take them into civilian life and be denied the enhancement that they're given. As in this case here of exoskeletal suits, it may be that a soldier, especially if they received a prosthetic, a military prosthetic or an exoskeleton that restores mobility to them, restores function to them, it may be that they very much want to continue to use that enhancement in civilian life. And we have the question of whether they will be allowed to do so, whether it's dangerous to allow soldiers to use military enhancements in civilian life. Some may be dangerous, others may be not. Some enhancements, such as those that prevent PTSD, can help soldiers to adjust to civilian life. As I said, the propranolol experiments for pre-dosing a soldier that's going into a conflict and who may start to experience PTSD as a consequence of battle, pre-dosing them with propranolol may prevent PTSD in the long run. But certainly those soldiers, as part of veteran aftercare, should have access to things like ketamine and psychedelics which have been shown to be very useful in the treatment of PTSD. So the aftercare for soldiers is very important as well. I mentioned The Flowers of Algernon. If you haven't read this novel, it's from the 1960s. It's about a man with severe cognitive impairments who is given an experimental cognitive enhancement drug. And he finds that it's wonderful to be able to think clearly and to understand what's going on around him and to communicate with people, to be smart, finally. And then the drug begins to wear off. The tragedy of the novel is what it's like to understand that you're going to lose what you've valued about what you've gained from this drug. And I think we will face that with soldiers who have cognitive enhancements, mobility enhancements as a consequence of their military service, and who want to keep those and who are not allowed to keep them. Okay. Coming in for a close here about world order. My position is that since 1945, since the invention and use of nuclear weapons, the nation state has been an immoral structure of world order. And that we have a very strong reason to want to commit to a rules-based international order that eventually evolves into a global political system that removes any threat of war and replaces war with the law enforcement, global law enforcement against rule breakers. People who invade other people's countries, people who commit genocide, should be subject to 1 million blue-helmeted troops that descend on them and stop whatever they're doing. So there will be conflict and there will be a need for weapons. I'm not a pacifist. But the position that I have evolved and that others have evolved is sometimes called cosmopolitan just war theory. The idea that military force is only legitimate today when it functions as international law enforcement sanctioned by supranational authority. Not just coalitions of the willing, but hopefully truly well-constituted, transparent, democratically accountable supranational authority. We don't have those. We need them. What we have instead is great power realism and the reassertion of global imperialisms that Trump has just committed to in his new national security policy, which is basically Berlin 1935, channeled through Kremlin 2025. But Xi, Putin, they have their own versions. Xi thinks all the countries in their region should be controlled, that they should control the South China Sea, even the parts that are internationally recognized as part of the Philippines or Indonesia or Taiwan or Japan or whatever, that in fact, China is the great power in the region. They should control the region. Putin has the same idea that he and Russia should control Eastern Europe, Ukraine as part of their great power assertion of authority. And the UN Security Council, when it was created after World War II, it was a concession to great power realism to say, well, there will be some permanent representatives on this body who are the de facto world powers. And they will be the ones who will decide permanently, along with now other rotating members, about whether UN troops, blue helmets, get to be deployed as policemen. And it's been pretty difficult to get Russia and China and the United States to agree on the deployment of blue helmets as a consequence of this great power realism. This is the current de facto situation that we're in. Neo-fascist in the US White House, collaborating with the neo-fascist in Putin and the imperialist in Beijing. And we have to get past this situation in order to create the kind of world order that would be able to exercise authority in this context, the collective security arrangements that we need in this context. Bringing it back to soldier enhancement, Soldier enhancement in arms control should be a part of the negotiations towards a new rules-based order, a new set of arms control agreements. But it is far from the most important question that we face. We need to face first the question of weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, bioweapons, nano weapons, things that could actually wipe out billions, not just the possibility of keeping soldiers alive longer on the battlefield. So the world that I want to see is one that transcends the nation state and its illegitimate rationales. For me, the goal is an accountable world state that controls most of the most powerful weapons in the world, whatever those weapons happen to be. If it turns out that enhanced soldiers are part of the most powerful weapons that threaten the world order, then I want the world state to control that as well. But it's not. It's probably not. It is unlikely that enhanced soldiers will ever be as important a military force as weapons of mass destruction or drones or robot soldiers. However, if they do turn out to be a force multiplier, I would like international treaties to address them as well. And if you want to follow more about this topic from me, even after this provocation, we are starting at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and the Applied Ethics Center at UMass Boston, a two-year program, research program on military enhancement and AI use in war, a research program that will involve a number of scholars. And I invite you to collaborate with us and follow our work at iet.org and iet.substack.com. Thank you very much for your attention. I know Annalita probably is cringing at my political interventions here, but I'm sorry. How could I possibly talk about the global world order without talking about the fact that fascists want us all to go to war?
What do you mean? I like it. And they did too.
Good.
I'm sure. All right. Thank you so much. So Q&A. Great lecture, by the way.
Thank you. Kathy is speaking, I think, but she's okay, muted.
Could you talk a little more about the research project that you were alluding to, that you're going to be working on that from 2026 to 2028 for those who may be interested?
Sure. So the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies is an independent think tank that has been in existence for 20 years. And we have focused our program in the last 5-6 years on human enhancement and artificial intelligence. And we're in collaboration, where I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, with the Center for Applied Ethics, which is directed by Nir Esakovitz, who is a philosopher who is primarily focused on the philosophy of war and conflict. The first two projects that we did were on the future of work and automation in particular. And this year, we're concluding a project on brain-computer interfaces. We're having a conference in June on brain-computer interfaces where James Giordano is actually speaking. But the next project will be on the applications of enhancement and artificial intelligence in the military and in war. We're hiring two doctoral candidates to work with us to also do conferences, white papers, research projects, papers, and so forth on this topic. Do you want to know more than that?
I think that's great. There could very well be those who are interested in pursuing that. Thank you.
Please contact us. We're very excited about the project.
Jay, why don't you tell us a little bit about China's production of, I see all sorts of articles, okay, a production of robot soldiers.
China's in particular?
China, yes.
I don't know them.
You don't, are these articles really
Well,
credible, or are they so ahead?
I mean, that is the problem, is that, as I said, the military industrial complex is very interested in producing scare articles about all these things and hyping anything that comes out of China. I think what we can say in general is, the Chinese state, and in particular the People's Liberation Army, is in charge of a lot more research and development, technological innovation than in the West. The balance of R&D between Silicon Valley and the Defense Department is much more Silicon Valley here, and in the People's Liberation Army, it's much more PLA. It's like half of all artificial intelligence research is PLA. Now, the other thing we can say is that we know that China is far more open to genetic modification. For instance, He, the scientist who announced 7-8 years ago now that he had genetically modified 2 embryos for the purposes of preventing HIV, which was absurd, but they got in a lot of trouble. He got in a lot of trouble. The Chinese state was embarrassed. They put him in prison for a while. He's back out, and he's married to another promoter of genetic modification, and they have an active and well-funded initiative now to do genetic modification of embryos. So, he got in trouble, but he's out of trouble, and it's an ongoing concern in China. So, in the context of what we know in public about what China does, how can we not suspect that there's all kinds of things going on inside the People's Liberation Army of human enhancement research along exactly the same lines that we know that the Defense Department in the United States is pursuing? Now, if you go back with Russia and the Cold War, we used to think that, Russia's developing the men staring at goats movie was about this, that we thought, the Russians are developing psychic powers, we have to do our own psychic power research. And it's like, they weren't. Maybe they were trying, but they didn't develop any psychic powers. So I think we have to take it all with a huge amount of caution. But I do think that there are research programs, covert research programs, as well as overt research programs going on in the major militaries around the world for these kinds of things. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I read. Yeah.
Isoken.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello.
Thank you.
Isoken, yeah. Please, it's Isoken's hand up. Yeah, I see.
What happened?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Robert, you just went back muted.
Okay, sorry about that. Sorry.
Okay.
It's okay. I'm calling from Nigeria. Yeah. Okay. So I'm joining this conversation from Nigeria. So I have a question. Considering the fact and the concerns about ethics.
You may want to put it in the chat.
Okay, you can't hear me?
You're cutting in and out, so you might want to put it in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I said when soldiers are enhanced to win a war, or when there's an enhancement in winning the war, I'm just wondering, how ethical could that win be? Is it possible to judge the ethics of the war and say, okay, this winning was ethical and not? Is it possible? Still get the question.
Yeah, I do. I mean, that was a point I was trying to make, was that for me, as a consequentialist, asking a soldier to take on risk or the use of a risky, controversial medical intervention is more acceptable and perhaps even morally obligatory in the context of a just war, a just conflict, and immoral if it is an immoral conflict, right? If it's an imaginary threat a non-proportional threat, if it is a war for conquest, a war for revenge. There are many different reasons that a conflict can be unjust. And in those contexts, I would say no, no risk asked of a soldier, including the risk of their life, which is usually the risk, but even the risk of medical experimentation can be just. And in the context of a just war, if we're preventing the deaths of millions, yes, asking a soldier to take a vaccine or to get a chip put in their brain or to take a drug, all of these are quite legitimate risks. They've already signed up or been drafted to sign up for the risk of dying, right? So how could it be possibly less moral to ask them to die than to ask them to take a drug or a chip or a vaccine? So yes, I think that the morality of the conflict, for me, as a consequentialist, determines the morality of the intervention. However, I did raise this side issue that even if the conflict is unjust, if the intervention is one that saves the soldier's life, right? If you were drafted as a Russian soldier from Uzbekistan or wherever, and sent into Ukraine, I don't think that you have an obligation to die for my consequentialist concerns about the unjustness of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I still think those soldiers have a right to live. And if you are a Ukrainian soldier who finds one of those Russian soldiers wounded, I think you should save their life as part of the international rules of war. And if you're a Ukrainian soldier who's a medic behind enemy lines treating Russian soldiers, I still think you should save their life, even if they're going to be sent back out to kill your comrades in Ukraine. So even in those circumstances, I think you can justify the use of these kinds of technologies because they save soldiers' lives. But in general, I would say the morality of the intervention is determined by the morality of the conflict. Nadia, and you're muted, yeah.
Thanks for this presentation. It was great. I have a question about the nanotechnology. How much can it pose challenge from ethical points of view? I mean, we can use it, they are invisible, we can use it to kill some dictator, we can use it, but if this technology is under a terrorist group, for example, etc., it can be really a risk for lots of people, or if this technology is under a control of a dictator to kill opponents, etc. I mean, how much is ethical to develop this kind of technology?
Well, again, nanotechnology is a potential weapon of mass destruction, as you mentioned. I do think we need to be considering its potential use. I would put it in the same category as weapons, as biological weapons. And in fact, it will probably be a quasi-biological weapon because biological weapons are nanotechnology, right? It's the ability to engineer with synthetic biology a virus that is targeted to just kill your enemy, a particular individual, a particular group of people. That capability is basically nanotechnology, right? It's just using biology as nanotechnology. So we should be concerned about it, and we should be regulating it as a part of international arms control agreements. Now, if you're in charge of, if you're in charge of the US military and you're worried about it, you have this problem that's called the gain of function research. You have to develop the thing that you're worried about in order to develop the protection against it, right? How can you know that your vaccine is going to work unless you have anthrax? You need the anthrax vaccine. You need anthrax. So in the case of nanotechnology, we need to be developing nanotechnology in order to know what kind of tools the Russians or the Chinese or the whoever the terrorists are going to develop and deploy against us. And that's the catch-22. Catch-22, again, another military metaphor. It means we have to do the thing that we don't want in order to protect against it. Now, I think the reverse part of your question is that there's always a mistake in technology ethics, for me, as far as I'm concerned, when people say, this technology could be used by a dictator, therefore we shouldn't have this technology. I don't follow, because if the United States or Europe decides not to develop a particular weapon, but that weapon can be developed. This was the case with nuclear weapons during World War II. The possibility that the Nazis could have developed nuclear weapons was 6 months later than the United States, right? So we could have lost World War II in that context if the Nazis had developed nuclear weapons first. So the idea that a dictator is in any way constrained by what liberal democracies do to suppress dangerous technology is not real, right? I don't think that that's the way to think about it. The way to think about it is liberal democracies need to create a world in which there are no conflicts, in which we have the ability to detect weapons of mass destruction and prevent them. Now, we've seen how successful that is, right? We just flattened all of Iran and maybe set back their nuclear weapons program by a month. So that was not a terribly effective way to go about that. We invaded Iraq thinking that we were preventing weapons of mass destruction and found almost none in Iraq. And we still don't know what to do about North Korea. So we still don't know how to control the weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons of mass destruction that we can easily detect. But, Clinton bombed, I think it was in Somalia, Clinton bombed what he thought was a bioweapons manufacturing facility. Turned out it was actually a medicine weapons facility. But the problem is that the difference between a medicine facility and a bioweapons facility is hardly any difference. Not to mention artificial intelligence, which people could be coming up with cyber weapons in their basement and no one would be able to detect. So this is the problem that we face currently, is that in order to adequately detect things like the development of nanotechnology weapons or nanoweapons, we need to have a global surveillance state that no one's prepared to enact. And it's a serious threat right now, how to control all weapons of mass destruction, and in particular, these new ones.
Thanks. You're right. The surveillance is the key. Thanks so much.
Come on. I must have provoked some other thoughts. I did my best.
I'd like to say something. The question of informed consent. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand before speaking.
That's all right.
The question of informed consent. I was just signing a form on the internet, and it occurred to me that the way these forms are designed, you are supposed to agree. You're supposed to agree to those conditions before you can even proceed or submit those forms. It means that if you don't agree to those conditions, you can't progress with what you want. So, for instance, a soldier wants to come into the army, he wants to serve the United States, but he may not be interested in going to war.
Sure, thought of that.
But the question will be, who is a soldier if not somebody that wants to fight? But the challenge is this: I want to war, I want to defend my country, I want to be a veterinarian, I want to be, but I'm not interested in taking any enhancements or any hormonal stuff that will change who I am. The question is, without agreeing to these conditions, which also have some hidden conditions, without signing that form and submitting the form that takes away all your rights, you cannot even have the privilege of serving in the army. So the question is, how ethical is it that by the time you say you want to serve your country, you end up losing so many obvious and hidden rights. Thank you.
Well, let me ask you a question, Isuken. I posed the two situations. One is a volunteer soldier, and the other is a conscripted soldier. Which one do you think has more right to refuse a treatment? The volunteer or the conscripted?
Both have the rights, because if you volunteer, yes, both have the right to refuse a treatment. Because if I volunteer, I volunteer under certain conditions. But if I'm conscripted, I don't even have any right at all, because I'm compelled to do it. However, it doesn't, because conscription does not indicate or automatically means that he should be subjected to things that he would not have consented to. I don't know. Well, I mean, these are my thoughts. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I think it's a hard nut. It is a difficult question because, as I said, I think there are circumstances where, as a consequentialist, and what I mean by consequentialist is I think the ends can justify the means, right? That if there are circumstances where you're going to save 1 million lives by forcing someone to do something, sending 10 soldiers to their death to save 1 million lives is a classic military conundrum, and it is warranted, right? That's what soldiers sign up for. Their lives may be sacrificed to save others. And so in that context, I find it hard to understand the argument that soldiers should have some kind of blanket right to refuse medical treatment. That's something that the military has decided would be useful when it's not even lethal, right? It might be in the rare circumstance lethal, but usually not lethal, these kinds of medical treatments. So I don't understand that part of the argument. But in terms of the two circumstances, the volunteer, when they sign up, you said, well, what if they signed up to go into military service, but not to be in war? It's like, what do you think military service is if it's not potentially war? Of course, it's going to be potentially war. If you signed up thinking it was just going to be hanging out with your buds, smoking dope, then that's your problem, right? So people have an obligation to the informed consent of military service in the first place. That was your first decision, whether you're going to inform consent to military service. If you are, then you lose a lot of your rights as a consequence, even the right to your own life. On the other hand,
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. When we talk about informed consent, it's clear that the personnel involved does not actually understand all the conditions, or all the conditions are not open to the person to make a decision. So yeah, it may be questionable when we call it informed consent.
Oh, I definitely agree with that. I mean, the empirical research on informed consent shows that most informed consent is just shadow acting. It's a play. You present the patient with 10 pages and say, it's like all of the user agreements. Whenever we sign up for a new piece of software, a new service, it says, here's the 10 pages. Do you agree? Yes, I agree. Well, at least scroll to the bottom before you say you agree. Okay, I scroll to the bottom. I agree. We never read any of these things. And even patients in clinical trials, when we ask them, okay, we told you this is a phase 1 clinical trial. The only thing that we're doing here is determining how much of this drug would kill you. We're not trying to even figure out at this point whether it works or not. We're just trying to figure out if it kills you. And then we say, okay, what do you think you just signed? Oh, I'm hoping that this will help me. This is a research project to figure out if this helps me. So yeah, patients don't understand what they're signing up for with informed consent. But what do? We still want to be in a world in which the obligation on the part of the medical profession is to try to explain to people what's going on. So I even though informed consent is usually meaningless, I still think it's a useful fiction that we have to pursue. But it's even less meaningful in the military context. And again, to just go back to the situation of the Iraq War, where soldiers were trying to refuse vaccinations to go into a situation where they might face anthrax or whatever. And they were right that there were unknown side effects of these drugs, but the legitimacy of their commanders saying, I understand that you have concerns, there may be unknown side effects, but we think on the best evidence that all of you need this vaccination in case we get hit by an anthrax bomb, and therefore you're going to get it whether you like it or not. So in that situation, what do? Do you say, well, you don't want it, you get to go back home with a dishonorable discharge, or we will put you in the brig, or something like that? That's one option. Or we just give it to them by force, or we give them the right to refuse, which is what apparently you favor, but I just don't understand that right to refuse in that circumstance.
Additionally, I have one more comment.
Sure.
Everything you've been talking about, clearly, many of the researches that are carried out by researchers is government sponsored. And when it's government sponsored,
I'm sorry, it's what?
Government. It means the government.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's government sponsored. They are financing, they are funding it. And if they are doing that, it means they have control over the results of particularly, you are giving a presentation now. You have an aim and an objective and a conclusion you want to draw. So if the government is funding this and the conclusion is already predetermined. So the question is, if the researcher decides and say, this drug, this enhancement has just 10% benefits and 90% consequences, negative consequences, what's the ethics of continuing that research? Thank you.
Well, as Anna helpfully pointed out, I am a socialist as well. And as a socialist, I think that if the government had any hand in developing, I think even if they didn't, but especially if they did have a hand in developing the technology, for instance, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, the prosthetic limb research that they've done, if they were then to say, okay, we're going to turn this over to this company, and they're going to be able to make a profit off of this and determine how much they get to charge for new prosthetic limbs that come out of this, because here in the United States, we don't do socialism, we do capitalism. So we're going to develop this in the government. We're going to spend billions of dollars to develop it. We're going to use soldiers involuntarily as the guinea pigs for this technology. And then we're going to turn it over to capitalism and let them charge profit out of it and determine who gets access to it. I think that's illegitimate, right? So I think anything that the government and almost all medical research is a product of government investment. All government research that results in some kind of technology, that we have an obligation to make sure that it is universally accessible and meaningfully accessible. Not just, yes, you could buy it, but that you actually do have access to it. Everybody, right now the World Health Organization has estimated that only 10% of the people in the world who need access to GLP-1 drugs to treat diabetes and obesity. I am one. I have lost 50 pounds in the last year on GLP-1 drugs. I'm an extremely lucky, affluent American. My wife's health insurance covered it 100%. I did not have to pay a penny for my GLP-1 treatment. But other people in the United States, my brother, for instance, does not have good health insurance, and he would have to pay $150 to $300 a month for it, and that's beyond his means. And many people don't even have health insurance in the United States and would have to pay $500 a month for it, and not to mention people in the developing world. Now, when HIV was being treated in the early 90s with antiretroviral drugs, those early retroviral drug treatments cost $40,000 a year, and only affluent gay American men had access to them. And nobody said, hey, it's immoral to have these drugs because only rich guys have access to them. What Brazil and South Africa and India said was, we have people with HIV. They need access to these drugs. We can't possibly afford to pay your exorbitant and confiscatory prices, you international pharmaceutical firms. And if you don't give us these drugs, the right to produce these drugs for $1 a day that we need to be selling them at, then we'll just start making them and we'll just start giving them to people, because that is the moral conundrum of international medical capitalism when people are dying, is you cannot defend the right to intellectual property in the context of people dying, right? So in that context, they did pressure those companies to lower their prices. And then Clinton and others enacted the International Program for HIV and tuberculosis and malaria, which put international funds so that eventually there was increased access in sub-Saharan Africa to those drugs. We're going to have that kind of inequality of access to all kinds of technology, starting within a country and then international access as well. So if there's a technology that spins off of medical enhancement of soldiers that is useful for civilians, and I'm sure there are going to be many, yes, I want them to be universally accessible to civilians. I think we have a moral obligation to nationalize them and make them accessible if they're not, and to make them accessible internationally as soon as possible. That's my socialist position on the thing.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello.
Hello, Haula.
Yes, Haule Lazaro from Tanzania. I have a concern about this soldier enhancement. I'm trying to think if there is a possibility of opting otherwise, since I'm thinking that, like you have explained, that an enhancement can bring further harm other than protecting this soldier. And to me, I think there are a lot of fallacies committed to this kind of this approach of enhancing the soldiers. Therefore, is there a way of opting otherwise, other than continuing with this exercise of soldier enhancement? Yeah, that's it.
Well, I'm not sure where you're going with the question. You mean, is there an option for soldiers who are being told that they need an enhancement, or that they are going to get one involuntarily? I mean, let's take one step back and say most soldier enhancement is voluntary. People, for instance, who enlist in the military have the option of what branch they serve in, usually. And if they decide to serve in a branch like Special Forces, where they're going to do special medical training, special physical training, and then potentially have special medical training as well, then that was a choice that they made, right? Just like we were talking about with the choice to sign up to enlist in the first place, if it's voluntary, and you didn't realize what it meant to be a soldier, you thought you were signing up for a bowling league, then really that's your problem. That's not their problem. That you signed up for being a soldier, which means that you potentially die. So I think that's where this issue of what's the difference between a conscription, involuntary military service versus voluntary military service. I think voluntary military service has fewer rights in my mind to refuse. Involuntary medical service, they come to your village, they say, you're going to serve in the military. I would like it to be a situation where they would be able to refuse involuntary medical treatment or enhancement. But if it's already involuntary military service, then it's unlikely to be a regime in which you have the right to refuse medical treatment in that service, right? They're going to tell you how long your hair is going to be, what kind of clothes you're going to wear, what kind of boots you're going to wear, how, what you're going to do with every minute of your day, including what medicine you're going to take. So I think, yes, we would like military service as much as possible in every country to be voluntary. When it's not, it's hard to imagine that there's an ethics involved in the first place, because nothing is a choice in that circumstance.
Thank you.
Sure. Such an international crew, Anna.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Well, I told you I'm in Romania. So some of them, we had more, but it's interesting. So people, maybe they're busy. Some people are busy. They have jobs, but
I'm not famous. I'm just a little guy.
I get more. I wanted to get more people from Europe, actually, but maybe funny enough, I didn't get too many from the US, you see. Maybe there is no, I don't know, that much interest in the New World Order. What can I say? We're very interested in the New World Order.
They may not be interested in the New World Order, but the New World Order is interested in them. So
in them, exactly. That's what I would. That's a good line. I might advertise it like this. You might not be interested in a New World Order, but look. Okay, now a question which is not necessarily about the military enhancement. Do you really think that we are getting to the? I'm becoming annoyed in a sense, but I can't stop not to watch. Constantly on the news here, we have this Putin and Putin and Putin and Trump, Putin, Trump, it makes Romanians a little bit crazy. The youngsters refuse to watch. But do you really think that we are getting there? I mean, Jonathan Moreno is a bit pessimistic.
Getting to the point of a military conflict between the United States and Russia?
Yeah. No, not the US. The US, constantly we see that, but those articles, but you already mentioned, when you see this military enhancement and with the Chinese, and that's also a political thing. You don't know how much they invest, you don't know where they are right now. But with this conflict.
Well, look, as much as I hate Trump, he does not wave nuclear weapons around as a threat the way that Putin,
I noticed that,
or Iran or North Korea do. So in terms of weapons of mass destruction being used as a threat, those three countries in particular have been very destabilizing to the world. Now, on the other hand, the United States, Israel, France, the other nuclear powers, we have the weapons, and we are the significant nuclear threat in the world. So if you're an optimist, you could say, well, now that Trump appears to be exactly on the same page as Putin and the Kremlin, there's less threat of nuclear war because they've just decided to carve up the world, and Russia gets Europe, and China gets Asia, and we get the Western Hemisphere, like the Monroe Doctrine. And that, you could say, if you're a realist, what's called a geopolitical realist, you could say that that's a less dangerous situation than liberal internationalism that Hillary Clinton did pursue, of saying that the United States and NATO should be pursuing democracy in Libya and Serbia and places like that. Now, I'm more sympathetic with the liberal internationalists. I do think I would like to see an empowered world order that had the military and political strength to defend human rights and democracy around the world, and that told countries like Russia that they are not allowed to invade their neighbors, or China that they're not allowed to take Taiwan, or the United States that they're not allowed to take Venezuela. So all of those situations are situations I would like there to be some kind of supranational blue-helmeted army. And insofar as the European Union represents a transnational democracy, and insofar as they rearm or repossess parts of NATO and to defend themselves against Russia, I'm in full support of that. I am not at all as concerned that German rearmament will lead again to World War II as I am that American rearmament and Russian rearmament will lead to World War II. So German and European rearmament, for me, represent a defense of liberal democracy against these neo-fascist forces. So, but that wasn't exactly your question, but whether Romanians should be worried about Putin? Yes, I think you should be worried.
Oh, of course they are.
Yeah, of course they're worried about Putin. They should be. Putin is a threat to Romania.
The Black Sea. He is our friend from Moldova. My friend Victoria, yeah. She can tell you exactly. It's not the
I'm really
the fear. Right.
What I don't understand is Kaliningrad. Why is there still a Russian footprint in Western Europe? There shouldn't be, but yeah, or Transnistria. It's like these little slivers of Russia that we allow to exist.
As Jonathan Moreno put it, my friend Jonathan, he keeps on saying, I miss the Cold War.
That's right. The Cold War had a certain simplicity to it.
Cold War, because
the Cold War was stable.
I wouldn't have been to the US.
That's right.
You miss the Cold War. That said,
my socialism was Cold War socialism because I was on the side of the West against the communists, and now nobody knows what to think anymore. It's like all the young socialists that I'm around, they think that I'm just an old fart for being anti-communist. It's like, you didn't live in the 20th century. I grew up in the 20th century.
Yeah. So we can say that there is a kind of a disorganized world. So we don't know.
Yeah. And I think that that's also a point of optimism, though, because the old world order was clearly inadequate, right? It was not. Yeah. So we need to create a new world order. And if Xi happens to be a pillar of the new world order that we create, I guess that's the new order that we get. But I would like it to be one that's centered on human rights and democracy, like the UN originally intended, and not on great power.
And now they want to smash the UN. I mean, it's
yeah.
Anyway, James, I'm so happy we reconnected this way. All right, online. Hope things will be much better so we can meet also in person somewhere, if not in the US. It's very difficult.
I haven't been to Romania. Invite me.
Definitely. But and you would be happy to come here. And also Romania, in Moldova, where Victoria, I was planning, not with Victoria, with someone else, a legal medical doctor, we were very close to do a summer school there. And they came. She came with her daughter in the US to a summer school there in person. But now look what happens. It's very difficult with traveling. Maybe not necessarily about the money. Think about that.
I know. Well, being an American abroad right now is a little dicey.
Really? Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Well, maybe
I have to wear my Canadian flag or something like that.
Yeah. All right. So
I wish you all the best with the rest of your meetings and good luck. If any of you have questions, or comments,
and they have everything. They have all the particulars.
Yes,
they can write emails. They can. So extraordinary, James, and thank you so much.
Sure.
And we're gonna have some. We're gonna send you some photos, and maybe you're not that type of guy to the photo that I have to. So.
Well, now that I'm thin and handsome, I love my photos.
Nah, you have always been handsome. Come on. I know you for more than 25 years, right? All right. But that it's not only about handsome, it's about the brain. So
Well, if you got a picture of my brain, I want to see it.
Yeah. Okay. We didn't talk about transhumanism. We didn't, but anyway, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.